Chapter 11 of Sacrifice, Part 1. The room felt more cramped than usual. Of course, all of Captain Pioff's residence was cramped, but the bedroom that Rarity and Pinkie Pie had been granted normally had a warm, homely feel to it. Now that Rarity had spent the last hour or so pacing restlessly across the small room, however, the walls were beginning to creep in whenever she looked away. Perhaps it was the shadow under the door that marked the presence of the bluecoat standing guard out in the hall. Perhaps every room felt smaller when you were no longer allowed to leave. Rarity pursed her lips, bringing her mind back to the present. They had been rushed back to Pioff's room hours ago in the wake of the explosion, earning several suspicious leers from the Frieslander soldiers. Captain Pioff had barely spared them a word as they were pushed through the streets, but rumor traveled almost as fast as the shockwave of the blast. The barons had sent saboteurs into the city, or they had hired mercenaries from abroad, or they had dug a tunnel under the wall, or it was sympathizers among the Frieslanders themselves, or. By the time Pioff had ushered them over the threshold of her home, all Rarity knew for certain was that a ship had crashed into a munitions depot, destroying one of the city's granaries and who knew how many lives. The strange, sheltered distance with which the common citizens had regarded the war had been shattered in an instant, and Rarity found herself glancing towards the door every few minutes, her ears twitching at every distant thud, wondering if a squad of bluecoats was going to storm inside and declare her and Pinkie guilty of sabotage. Pioff had assured them they'd be safe. They had been at the wall during the act, giving them a solid alibi. The guard stationed outside her home confirmed that Pontius had been at the table downstairs writing a letter to his father, and the younger stallion was now sequestered alone inside the guest room, despite his loud complaints about being separated from his wife. He had kept it up for several minutes, pounding his hooves on the door and demanding to see Rarity, but thankfully he'd settled down before the guards grew annoyed enough to do something about it. Whitehorn, however, was nowhere to be found. He had left that morning with no details as to his destination, and had yet to return. Rarity shivered as she thought back to the fire in Pioff's eyes, of the sharp flap of her coat around her hooves as she marched out into the street, of the two soldiers that had fallen in behind her, and the rhythmic creaking of the harnesses holding their guns at their sides.
"You ain't here, dear hearts,"
she said, the playful lilt gone from her voice.
"We'll talk when I get back."
It was approaching sunset already, and the captain had not come back.
"Hey, Rares?"
Rarity jumped, looking up to where Pinkie was standing by the open window, one hoof resting on the sill. Her lips were quirked in a concerned frown, an expression that did nothing for the fluttering in Rarity's breast.
"Yes, Pinkie?"
Pinkie tipped her head towards the street. Her mane had lost most of its poof, the curling tip of her bangs dripping low between her glistening blue eyes.
"Do you hear this?"
Rarity's ears turned forwards as she approached the window. The street was bathed in the red of sunset, the light flickering with the distant heat of the fire towards the core of the city, and ponies trotted past with their heads down and their lips set. She glanced west towards the fire, but couldn't tell if it had grown or diminished in ferocity since the attack. A thin, acrid smog hung in the air, stinging at her eyes and nose. A filly stood on a crate next to a stack of thick papers, her little lungs casting her voice over the scene as the stallion beside her waved the broadsheets at whoever would spare him a glance.
"Barons launch terror attack against Old Westfort! 100 deaths and rising! Fire spreading through Rampart as full tide its marches to enslave us! 1 bid for Governor Rhea's official statement and more!"
With a start, Rarity realized that some of the ponies stopping to buy broadsheets were glaring up towards their window, chattering amongst themselves in a resentful hush. She pulled Pinkie away from the window, slamming the pane shut with her hooves.
"Hey!"
Pinkie exclaimed.
"I'm afraid it would be best if we kept our heads down, darling. At least for the moment."
Rarity said, eyeing the guard's shadow under the door. Could she get him to buy a broadsheet for them? Was it worth the risk?
But we didn't do anything!
Rarity's pacing resumed in earnest. She was glad the carpet kept her hoofsteps from resonating.
No, we didn't. But ponies don't always think rationally in times of stress. We should wait for Captain Pioff to return before getting ourselves involved. She has the respect of the citizens, and she...
Rarity let out a soft gasp, looking to Pinky and lowering her voice.
Can we trust her?
Pinky cocked her head.
Huh? The captain, darling.
Rarity glanced towards the door as she drew Pinky in close.
You and her spent a night out on the town, yes? She is our alibi, but there is no guarantee that she would speak for us. What do you think?
Pinky gave an adamant shake of her head.
Pioff isn't like that, Rarity. She just wants to protect her friends like any pony else does.
Rarity let out a slow breath.
Goodness, that's a relief. Now if only we knew where Whitehorn was, I might actually be able to sit down. You don't think he did it, do you?
Pinky asked.
Heavens, no. He's a gentle colt, not a terrorist. I'm merely worried for his well-being.
Rarity bit her lip, thinking of him being caught by a crowd of angry citizens on his own. She tugged at her mane with a hoof, driving the disturbing image from her mind.
Did you see them? Before the crash? You mean Anna and Gabba? Hush, dear, not so loud.
Rarity raised a hoof to Pinky's muzzle, glancing back at the shadow under the door. Had it moved? Did the guard mare have her ear to the door? Rarity turned back to Pinky, speaking in a quiet whisper.
Familiarity may be mistaken with partnership in times of tension. We should wait until we can discuss it together before associating ourselves with the perpetrators.
Pinky frowned, tugging Rarity's hoof away with one of her own. She at least had the decency to whisper back.
But they could be getting away right now. And what if they come back to hurt more ponies? We were on the wall, Rare Bear. How could we have helped them steal a ship? Pinky, you saw how those ponies were looking at us.
Rarity jerked her head at the shut window. A thought occurred to her, and her horn glowed as she pulled the curtains closed, just to be safe.
Suffice it to say, darling, they weren't exactly wondering how to replicate our main styles. We must tread carefully.
Pinky looked down as she tapped a hoof against her chin. After a couple of seconds, she let out a sudden gasp, her lips turning up into a bright smile.
I could talk to them. I'm sure they'll understand once I get everyone to laugh a little. Pinky, nobody is going to feel like laughing.
Rarity hissed.
This is not the time.
Pinky waggled her eyebrows with a confident smirk before turning for the window.
Pfft. I'm perfectly positive there's no pack of ponies on the planet that Pinkie Pie Pink Party Pony Prodigy couldn't possibly palliate to barley. Pinkie Pie, please pacify yourself.
Rarity rushed in front of her, holding a hoof to the other mare's shoulder.
This isn't Ponyville anymore, darling. I know you mean well, but we can't keep acting like it is.
She sighed, slumping down onto her haunches and resting her head in her hooves with a weak moan.
Oh, sweet Celestia, I can't keep acting like it is.
How many times had she failed now? She had been unable to defend herself from Duke Titus, and helpless in her attempts at negotiation with Governor Rhea. And every day, more ponies died. How was she supposed to bring peace to an Equestria that rejected it at every turn? Rarity stiffened at a solid thud from downstairs, followed by muffled footsteps. Another thud was followed by the scraping of moving furniture and soft voices. Rarity turned to Pinky, gesturing towards the bedroom door and whispering,
"Watch the door, please."
Pinky gave an emphatic nod, sneaking over to the door with an exaggerated gait that, for whatever reason, seemed to keep her wheels from creaking. Rarity's horn glowed as she pulled the rug off the ground, rolled it up, and leaned it neatly against a wall before she leaned down and pressed her ear to the tiles. It was difficult to hear through the stone floor, but after screwing her eyes up and making a few adjustments to her position, she found herself able to make out scattered words.
Too easy going. Shouldn't be escorts.
That sounded like Pioff, speaking the stern tone of her rank instead of the casual tour guide's persona she'd presented so far. The next voice was easy to identify as Whitehorn. Calm, personable.
Hardly necessary. Countess Rarity?
Rarity imagined him sitting with his usual cordial posture, his glasses dirtied from the smoke of the fire and his vest rumpled from whatever roughness the soldiers must have put him through. Was there a gun barrel pointed at his head? Manacles holding his hooves down? Rarity's pulse quickened as she held her breath and pushed her ear further against a crack in the stone, straining to hear more.
The Countess and her Huff-Maiden are none of your concern at the moment. I've been lenient, Whitehorn, allowing you to come and go without asking for details. I'll find out if you've betrayed my trust.
Captain, I understand that tensions are high. I'm certainly as eager as you are to find justice for this act, but jumping to conclusions is just as likely to ensure they go free as it is to catch them.
Let's cut the double talk, Whitehorn.
Of course. I'm only trying to help.
Rarity could practically hear the apologetic smile on his face.
I spent the day visiting local printing presses, looking into rates. I can provide a list of establishments if you wish, and I'm sure they'd all corroborate my story.
Planning on distributing sheets? Fair warning, love. Propaganda against Governor Rhea can be considered treason.
I assure you, I have no quarrel with your governor. I see you have my book on your shelf.
Rarity frowned at that. Whitehorn had written a book? Why hadn't he ever mentioned it before?
A riveting read, but we aren't here to discuss political philosophy over drinks.
My apologies, Captain. I like to carry instances of my writing with me, you see, but unfortunately have been unable to replenish my stocks after certain calamities that befell me before coming here. I was simply looking to print a few copies for personal use.
Her frown deepened. Surely by now he would have shared his writings with her, or mentioned the loss of them after Fellis Island? And couldn't he have printed more copies at Stratera before they left for Alta Lucia? Had she ever actually read anything penned under his name? She shook herself, refocusing back on her eavesdropping before she missed too much.
Be held in your room while further investigations are made, Captain Pioff said, and I will be following up on this list.
The scraping of chairs and the stomping of hooves reached Rarity's ear, and with a start she realized that there were ponies ascending the stairs. She threw herself back against the bed, scrambling to return the rug to its proper place with a flick of her horn. Pinky arched a brow, leaning in to whisper.
What did you hear? I'll tell you later, Pinky,
Rarity whispered back, brow furrowing as she fussed with the rug.
Does this look right? Perhaps over there? Looks fine to me. You're better at this kind of thing than I am anyways. Yes, darling, but I don't need to satisfy us.
The hooves were in the hall now. Was that 2 sets or 3? The shadow under the door shifted as the guard outside snapped to attention.
I need to satisfy them!
Pinky cocked her head, her lips scrunched up in confusion.
I don't know, Rares. I think you might find your interior decoration career more fulfilling if you focused on what you want to do instead of pleasing crowds and critics.
There wasn't time to get it perfect, and she couldn't exactly remember how the rug had been arranged anyways. She could hear the door across the hall, the guest room where Pontius and Whitehorn slept, opening and closing, and hooves shuffling about outside. With one last push of magic, she flattened the rug against the floor and tugged the wrinkles out of her dress. It was only when the door began to open that Rarity realized her mane still looked as if it had been pressed up against the floor.
Sorry I took so long, dear hearts.
Pioff stepped into the room with a calm smile, her voice soft and warm. She blinked, eyes widening as she focused on Rarity.
By the wall, Countess, are you well?
Rarity smiled sheepishly as she levitated a brush to her mane. She decided to embrace her breathless nerves instead of trying to hide them.
I'll survive, Captain, even if this dreadful stress and arid air takes a toll out of my mane. I hope things are well in the city. As well as they can be, I'm afraid.
Pioff sighed, closing the door shut behind her. The shadow of the guard outside was nowhere to be seen.
The fire's contained for now, and relief efforts are underway. We found Whitehorn as well.
She paused, looking up expectantly.
Oh, Celestia!
Rarity raised a hoof to her forehead and feigned a fall against the bed frame. She saw Pinky suppressing a giggle out of the corner of her eye, but Pioff didn't seem to notice.
Oh, we were so worried. Is he hurt? Just a few scratches, luckily,
Pioff said, watching as Pinky stepped over to help Rarity back to her hooves.
We would have found him quicker if he had told us where he went.
Rarity looked up to Pioff with wide eyes, fanning at her face with a huff.
I beg your pardon, Captain, but he doesn't normally keep us abreast of his every move. I do so hope he hasn't gotten himself caught up in anything dangerous. That's yet to be seen, Countess.
Pioff's eyes performed a quick scan of the room, causing Rarity's heart to skip a beat.
For now, however, you should both remain here, for your own safety. I can bring you some food if you wish. Oh, that would be simply divine, but I don't think I could stomach a meal while there's so many ponies in danger.
Rarity breathed a heavy sigh.
Is there anything we could do to help? It would go a long way toward easing my mind.
Pioff arched a brow.
You should stay here, love. You could barely even stand when I walked in, and now you intend to go play hero? I was merely overcome with relief, Captain. I know it may seem otherwise at times, but I am a man of action, and there is little more harmful to my composure than being cooped up inside while those I care about may be trapped in a blazing inferno.
Rarity looked up to meet the other mare's eyes, taking a deep breath and straightening her stance.
I would remind you that my hoof maiden and I are powerful gifted. We could do much to aid the relief efforts.
She paused, tossing her disheveled mane and fluttering her eyes.
Perhaps you could provide escort.
Pioff hardened her gaze, turning away and causing her coat to flutter about behind her.
Not until we finish our investigation.
Rarity blinked, watching open-mouthed as Pioff opened the door.
What? Captain, I'll bring you some dinner.
Pioff didn't even look back.
So that's it then?
Rarity wondered. The door would close, and she would have failed yet again. Charm, manners, courtesy. None of it seemed capable of getting her into a position to help the ponies of Alta Lucia. All of her skills were worthless. But no, there was another side to her. It was not behavior proper for a lady, but as Rarity's brow furrowed into an ugly crease and her lips pulled back into a shivering snarl, she found that she was getting rather tired of having others tell her when she could and couldn't help.
Do not walk away from me!
Rarity's horn burst into light, the telltale blue sparkling of her magic wrapping around Pioff's coat and tugging the mare roughly back into the room. The captain yelped in alarm as the magic twisted her back to face Rarity and slammed the door behind her.
I am trying to help, darling!
Rarity snapped.
I understand that you have your suspicions, I truly do, but there are ponies in pain out there, and we have done nothing to indicate anything but the best intentions for all ponies involved in this mess!
Pioff blinked. One of her hooves reached for something under her coat, but was wrenched back into place by the magic tied around her outfit.
Why are all you ponies constantly so caught up in your little petty rivalries? I have been nothing but courteous and polite in the face of your lecherous behavior, cordial in spite of your governor's callous dismissal of my attempts at peace, and respectful of your every request, and yet you think to lock me away in this room like some renegade saboteur! Pinky and I have barely left your side since we walked through your gatehouse, Captain! I don't even care if you want to keep a gun trained on me the whole time, but with Celestia as my witness, I am going to help somebody in this wretched world if it kills me!
Her breath came out in a heated snort. With a slight start, she noticed that the door had opened again during her tirade, and a blue-coat stallion was standing in the threshold, his eyes uncertain and the trigger string of his rifle between his teeth. Rarity's eyes widened ever so slightly as she saw the gun barrel pointed in her direction. A part of her immediately regretted her last statement. Pioff coughed, raising a hoof to the soldier.
Down, Ensign. I have this handled, thank you.
The stallion arched a brow. You're sure, Captain?
Yes, just a minor diplomatic dispute with the delegates.
Pioff said, straining to speak past the tightness of her uniform.
I'll call if you're needed.
Pinky waved a hoof as the soldier hesitated.
Hiya! Don't worry, Rarity isn't gonna hurt any pony. We're just here to help.
With an uncertain nod, the stallion dropped his trigger string and stepped outside, slowly closing the door behind him. After a few seconds, Pioff spoke.
Excuse me, dear heart. Could you slacken up about the neck a tad? Oh, my apologies. That wasn't very appropriate behavior.
Rarity gently set Pioff's hooves back onto the floor, straightening the other mare's coat out with her magic.
It's fine, Countess. Though I'd caution you about doing that around any of the more veteran troops.
Pioff blew a relieved breath out through her mouth, shaking her head.
I believe perhaps I can empathize with your position.
Rarity leaned in.
So, you'll reconsider then?
Pioff sighed.
Yes. I shall escort you to the relief site for the citizens' sake. Just you.
She added, turning to where Pinky was clapping her hooves together with an eager grin. Pinky's face fell.
Aww. I'm taking a risk here, you understand, but...
Pioff shrugged, meeting Rarity's gaze once more.
My instincts tell me that you mean well. Be a dear and don't prove me wrong, or I'll have to send the rest of your delegation to the dungeons.
Rarity grimaced, glancing towards Pinky. The bouncy mare gave her an exaggerated nod and wink.
I understand. Thank you. Exquisite. In that case...
Pioff gestured towards the door with a flourish.
Let us depart immediately.
It was a short walk out into the streets, and Pioff's epaulette-decorated blue coat parted the leering crowds like sharpened scissors on fine cloth as they broke out into a steady canter. Rarity had opted to put her mussed-up mane into a makeshift bun, rather than waste time straightening it. As much as it pained her, there were ponies in danger, and she was finally being allowed to help. The sun had dipped down below the island line now, and the brilliant red it painted over the clouds was beginning to give way to the flickering yellows and oranges of the fires. Glancing back, Rarity saw an airship floating high to the east, roughly over where she estimated the Baron's siege camps to be. She gasped as it dropped a flickering ball of flame, which plummeted through the sky like a miniature meteor before dipping out of sight behind the wall.
What are they doing?
She cried, pulling up to Pioff's side.
Those airships! It's called Retaliation, love,
Pioff said. She kept her eyes forward, not even out of breath from the quick pace.
Or did you think we'd take this lying down? Governor Ray would be a fool to let the Baron strike at us like this without some kind of counterattack, and she doesn't take kindly to the deaths of civilians. But it isn't just soldiers in those camps,
Rarity said breathlessly. They turned a corner, allowing Rarity to get clearer sight of the airship angling away from the burning silhouettes of giant arrows zipping around it.
I have a friend in there! She's just a healer! The Baron should have considered that before they destroyed a fort so old it served more as a landmark than an actual military facility.
Pioff growled.
There were only a few militia ponies stationed there, but the fire threatened the whole district.
Rarity couldn't come up with a real argument for that. And either way, she was having trouble keeping her breath as it was.
Fluttershy isn't as helpless as she acts,
she assured herself.
She'll be fine.
Or, more likely, she would be rushing to help the wounded. And she may not have anyone to hold her back until the bombing stopped. The thin layer of smoke in the air stung at her eyes, and Rarity squeezed them shut as she tried to focus on the aching stitch in her chest instead. Stressing over Fluttershy wasn't going to do anything but impair her efforts to help the pony she could reach. Finally, Pioff began to slow. Rarity sucked in a deep breath as she stumbled to a stop beside the captain and took in her surroundings. She had never seen the old fort up close when it still stood, but the shape of the foundation was still apparent in spite of the damage done. The fort's towers had all collapsed into long lines of rubble 2 or 3 times taller than the ponies climbing over them, in search of those trapped underneath. And even those parts of the plaza surrounding the fort not blocked off by rubble were pockmarked by loose stones heavy enough to seriously injure anyone they struck. The surrounding buildings, mostly stone, were stained black from the fires that had consumed anything flammable inside them, their tops open to the sky like mouths gaping in shock. At the center of it all, almost hidden behind the surviving foundations of the fort, was a deep crater, with the wreck of an airship half buried inside. Most of the ship had been scattered around the plaza with the force of the explosion, several of the sharp metal pieces visibly embedded into surrounding buildings or even in the street itself, but the prow was still stuck in the center. A few ponies were clambering over the tilted surface, prying at the half-melted door of a cabin with a crowbar. Rarity's eyes were fixated on the charred bodies organized into a neat pile, like discarded spools of thread. Their coats the same ashen black as the teeth visible in their silently screaming muzzles. Moans of pain drifted from a large, burnt-out building just beside the pile, and she watched as an exhausted earthmare dragged a stretcher with a deathly still pony towards it. She tipped the stretcher over, dumping the body on the pile with a sound like autumn leaves crunching under hoof. It had been a Pegasus once, but now only a pair of red-black stumps poked from its back. There was a stench in the air. Rarity had never smelled anything like it before, but it was easy for her to make the connection to the bodies. She doubled over with a grunt, mixing her bile in with the ash coating the cobbles. Pioff gave Rarity a sympathetic pat on the back as she wiped her mouth with a handkerchief.
You see what we're fighting for now, Countess?
She asked softly.
This is why we build our walls.
Rarity wasn't sure if she was shaking with fury, pity, or guilt. Anatomi's cocky grin was stuck in her head, mocking her with its predator's smile. How could she have put her soul into making a dress for a being that would commit such an act? How could she have ever trusted such a monster?
Never again,
she resolved. If she was ever unlucky enough to cross paths with the Thestral again, she would not make the same mistake.
Are you sure you're up for it, love?
Pioff asked.
We can head back if it's too much. No, it's... I'll manage. Thank you.
Rarity straightened up, setting her jaw.
I'll help tend to the wounded.
Pioff nodded.
A noble goal. We'll each do our part.
Rarity led the way, weaving around the loose rubble and stepping into the stone skeleton of the field hospital. The smell was even stronger here, threatening to overwhelm her, but she would not back down. A new voice reached her ears. It was Amara's voice, rough with the accent of the Barren Lands.
Countess Rarity? Sun and Sky, is that you?
Rarity turned to see a soft pink earth bear approaching her with awe in her eyes. Her mane tied up in a high ponytail, her cheeks marred with ash, and her white apron stained with the dark red of dry blood. For a moment, Rarity didn't recognize her, but then a name jumped to the front of her mind in a flash of memory.
Riverboy,
she breathed, brow furrowed in confusion.
What are you doing here?
Pioff was eyeing the skinny mare with undisguised suspicion.
You know this Barren Lander, Countess?
Rarity gave a slow nod.
Indeed I do. She and 5 others attempted to capture me for ransom out in the countryside.
Pioff straightened up, reaching into her coat and retrieving a pair of iron manacles. River flinched back at the sound, and several other ponies stole quick glances towards the trio before focusing back on their work.
I shall have her taken Old Westfoot at once.
Pioff stiffened, glancing out one of the empty windows towards the crash site.
Or, well, I suppose the rampart post shall suffice for now. Let's not be too hasty, Captain,
Rarity said, placing a soft hoof on Pioff's shoulder.
I later made a great sacrifice for this mare and her companions, and she's the only one that didn't spit in my face for it. Last I recall, however, they were still in the Duke's dungeon.
River kept her eyes down, one hoof rubbing anxiously over the other.
The Duke set us free after your wedding, Countess.
Rarity frowned.
I was never told of this. I tried to speak with you,
River said to Rarity's hooves.
The guards wouldn't allow me past the gate, and they kept telling me you were busy in your rooms. And after the first night, they started threatening me, so...
She grimaced, shaking her head.
I figured you were right to hate me.
Rarity raised her hoof to her lips as a soft gasp escaped her. The days following her wedding had since blurred together into a broken mess of self-pity with only a few brief glimpses of lucidity. She knew she had turned callers away from her door many times, everything from servants delivering meals to her friends asking after her well-being. How many times had she rejected River's request for an audience without realizing, so caught up in her wallowing that she couldn't even spare the time to speak to one of the ponies she had sacrificed so greatly for?
I don't hate you, River.
She sighed, pursing her lips.
Well, perhaps I did hate you at the time, but I wasn't quite in my best mind at the time. I just felt so stupid, so...
River cringed backwards at the outburst, drawing a grimace from Rarity.
I'm sorry, darling. I've just been so stressed lately and... confused.
She fell silent, and for a few seconds neither mare said anything. Pioff raised the manacles again.
So, shall I arrest her, dear heart?
River bowed her head at the question, dipping into a low bow.
Aye, you should, Captain. Me and mine wronged the Countess for the sake of our greed, and we never deserved her.
She paused, taking a deep breath and straightening up to face Pioff directly.
But I've tried my best to live up to her gift. I'll work honest labor here in Friesland now, and give what time I can to the service of my fellow pony. If you see fit to judge me here, I won't stop you.
Rarity's eyes widened, her lips parting as a strange fluttering stirred in her core.
I don't believe any further punishment is warranted here, Captain. River Pie has already been sentenced for her crimes, and it's clear to me that she's seen the error of her ways.
Pioff shrugged, stowing her manacles once more.
Well, that's a relief. It's more than a stroll to Rampart Post.
Rarity raised a hoof to River Pie's shoulder.
Face me, Miss Pie. I'd rather speak to you eye to eye if it can be helped.
River stiffened at Rarity's touch, but she complied. Still, her eyes darted from side to side like flighty birds, never staying on Rarity's face for long.
Thank you for your mercy, my lady.
Rarity brought her hoof to River's chin, guiding the mare's gaze until it steadied onto her own. She offered up a tentative smile.
Would you like to help me make the world a better place, Miss Pie?
For a long, silent moment, Rarity's world focused in on the other mare. This one mare whom she had sacrificed so much for in the spirit of harmony. It hadn't felt like a choice at the time, but the shadow of the decision had haunted her ever since. But now, at last, Rarity had a sign that her efforts weren't for nothing. In that moment, she knew if she had truly influenced just this one mare to embrace the forgotten ways of harmony, she might sleep easy again. At last, River gave a firm nod.
Hi, my lady. I don't know if I can, but I'll do everything in my power to be worthy of your gift.
Rarity released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding, as she blinked the wetness out of the corners of her eyes. The uncertainty haunting her faded into memory, giving way to the warmth that pulled her cheeks up into a wide smile.
You've already done enough, darling. I made the right decision. It was worth it.
River shot a nervous glance towards Pioff with a hesitant smile of her own.
Shall we get to it then?
Rarity shook her head, wiping the tears away from her eyes.
Yes, of course. Where are we headed?
Pioff waved a hoof around the field hospital. There were over 24 ponies splayed out on bedrolls, haystacks, and rag piles.
Everywhere, Countess. We can handle it, Miss Pie. Together.
Rarity took a deep breath as she scanned the rows of wounded. There were a few other ponies helping with the healing, but they were clearly overworked.
We'll just take it one pony at a time.
Twilight had thought that she understood nightmares. How many had she been through now? She had trudged through the broken bones of her home and read the last words of a desperate mare, traversed the literal nightmare realm of an old soldier and a slumbering alicorn, dug through the rubble of a sinking city searching for the bodies of her best friends, and lived through the torment of a malicious entity that sought to twist her mind to match its own image. She had spent days in the ruins of Canterlot, watching her own body mutate to match the form of the monster she hid from, and witnessing the final result of the transformation in one of her closest friends. But even she, it seemed, still hadn't seen it all.
Country mare's first time in the big city?
Midnight asked from atop a pile of bones twice as tall as she was.
Just as much for you as for me,
Twilight grumbled. Midnight snorted. She leaned back with a wistful sigh.
Breathtaking, isn't it?
Stalliongrad had been a city with hundreds of thousands of ponies within its limits, and it showed. The imposing concrete blocks of its buildings had acted like a giant drain gate during the floods, catching the bodies of the drowned in their shattered windows and narrow alleys. Looking up, Twilight could see the bony limbs of hundreds of bodies protruding from the cracked building faces like wildflowers, swaying with the gentle ministrations of the ocean current.
But Canterlot wasn't like this.
She watched as a sea pony swam up to the tallest surviving floor and tugged on one of the grisly weeds, snapping it free before disappearing with its treat ensnared between its fangs.
Canterlot's population was almost half as large, and there weren't nearly this many bodies. A mystery for the ages, little flower.
Midnight mused.
I'd prefer if we focused on the mystery of our next meal.
Twilight pursed her lips, turning to the apparition with a sharp frown.
It can wait! For the moment, yes. But you can't truly expect to parade me through such a plentiful buffet without accepting a few distractions.
There were hundreds of sea ponies in Stalliongrad, and other creatures besides. Everywhere Twilight looked, she caught glimpses of mutated ponies swimming through the sea, twisted dogs burrowing into the sand, and flocks of small birds swarming through the streets, their beaks rimmed with fangs that were almost comically large compared to their bodies.
It can wait,
Twilight repeated, ignoring the way Midnight's smirk hovered in the back of her mind. It knew she was just stalling. She was loath to kill an innocent creature, even a monster like a sea pony, but they both knew she would have to eventually. She was a predator now, whether she liked it or not. She tried not to think about the fact that they all seemed to be avoiding her. She didn't like the way that Midnight would cackle in her ear every time a sea pony caught sight of her and sped away. The thoughtful frown on her face faded as she turned a corner, bringing Stallion's palace back into view. She could have easily teleported past all the tightly condensed city blocks to save time, but she had opted instead to travel on hoof, taking in the image of Stalliongrad from ground level through the soft glow of her shield, and so it had taken her a couple of hours to find her way here. The palace was huge, towering over the surrounding buildings so high that Twilight had to sit down and crane her neck to see the massive statue of 3 rearing ponies on the top, one of each tribe. The central tower jutted out from atop a half-dozen lower tiers, each one a wider circle than the one above it, and displaying proud rows of thick columns, and the whole building was raised off the ground by a massive slab of concrete, accessible only by a long flight of dozens of steps. It had been a marvel of equestrian architecture at the time of its construction, and the fact that it still stood after everything that happened sent Twilight's mind racing with questions. If only she had been able to see it before it was surrounded by bodies, at the bottom of the ocean. She trotted forwards, grimacing at the skeletons that clung to the palace's stairs and wrapped around its many columns, and being cautious to avoid stepping on any bodies. The corpses here were different from those in the rest of the city. Many of them wore armor, either rusting plates haphazardly strapped onto the body, or the carefully curved outfits of the royal guard, and signs of violent death were commonplace. Many of these ponies hadn't been crushed by rushing waves or slammed against unyielding buildings, but had instead had their skulls caved in by powerful bucks, or their bones chipped and scraped by sharp weapons. Whatever they might have fought over, their bodies had all collected in the same piles in the end.
Ooh, I like that one,
Midnight said.
A delicious thought.
Twilight rolled her eyes as she started up the steps. A trio of sea ponies that had been scrapping over a body at the top scattered as she approached.
What's your plan here, little flower?
Midnight asked.
It's quite a large building to search on hoof, and we only agreed on a day-long detour.
Instead of answering, Twilight poured a burst of magic into her horn. She cast a series of powerful, focused pings, piercing the imposing facade of the palace in an even pattern. She cocked her head as her attention was drawn downwards to a large block of magically reinforced steel set deep in the foundation and almost as wide.
That feels like a vault,
Twilight thought.
If anything survived the floods, it'll be down there. There's an idea.
Midnight draped a chilling hoof over Twilight's shoulder, whispering into her ear.
Do you think there's any survivors?
Twilight's heart fluttered at the idea. Could it be possible for ponies to have survived down here all this time? Their whole world condensed to a minuscule steel stable? Perhaps, if it had been built with such a purpose in mind, with farms and recycling equipment and a sustainable source of power, but why would any pony have thought to prepare for such a terrible calamity? No. Most likely, the vault was made for short-term storage, or as a bunker to wait out shorter disasters, more on the time span of weeks or months than centuries. Most likely, she wouldn't find anything there but more bodies, and whatever the bodies had brought with them. But there was still that chance, wasn't there? Would they even see her as a pony? Would they even be aware of the horrifying nightmare swimming only a short teleport away? For all she knew, any survivors could have regressed into a stunted tribal society, scrabbling over the limited regenerating resources of their artificial home with no knowledge of the world beyond. For all she knew, they could hail her as a goddess.
That would be nice.
Twilight gave a slight shake of her head. She closed her eyes, forming the teleport spell in her mind, and vanished in a flash of magic.